Hello, my name is Hugh Fullerton. I am RadioTimes.com's sci-fi and fantasy editor. And if you're watching this, it's because you've been joining us for our hashtag RT Watch of Merlin Series 1, Episode 1, The Dragon's Call. We've just been watching it over on Twitter. Hi, you are just going to be showing you now. Hello, we are live. So, we are all going through some strange technological educations in these, as they say, unprecedented times. But guys, we are now live with the Merlin fans who are watching on. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to join with me and chat about the Dragon's Call and Merlin. Are you both okay?
We're good.
Yeah, good.
And hello, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, no worries. Right, so I'm just going to crack on because I know you're both very busy. I have a few questions here, from me and then from some of the fans who have pre-submitted some questions. So first off, looking back to when you were shooting this first episode, The Dragon's Call, I mean, could you have ever known what a long life Merlin would have? I mean, people are still talking about it today. It's still being shown today.
I think we did actually. I remember at the time Jane Tranter, who's the head of drama at the read-through, said when we were reading the first two episodes, she says, everybody around this table, please remember this moment because this show is going to be a huge hit. And I remember at the time thinking, oh God, don't say that. You're going to jinx it. It's not going to work. And then she was absolutely right. It did extraordinarily well, but we never thought that it would really last for as long as it did. You always make the show as well as you can and hope that it connects with an audience. And fortunately, it did.
And Julian, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think it's more than that, though. I think that the show was very successful, and you never know that, but it was. I think there's a difference with some shows. They last a long time, and they're reasonably rare, but they have a life beyond the normal cycle of TV, and they're watched by people, even a decade or so beyond when they were made. And that's happened with this one, and that's pretty rare. And I can't, in all honesty, tell you why that's happened with this one and not others, but it seems to have a life that keeps going.
And the Merlin legend is so popular, and it's lived through so many hundreds and hundreds of years that I think there's something about the legend as well. Don't you think, Julian, that kind of connects?
I think legend has resonated with people for more than 1,000 years, and there's a reason for that.
The pilot episode of a series is always quite tricky to nail. I mean, what were the biggest challenges with The Dragon's Call specifically?
I think there were lots.
Yeah, there are loads. I think the pilot episodes of fantasy series are the hardest of all. If you're making a detective show, you sort of know you're going to find a body and set up some suspects. But when you do a fantasy show, you have to do two things that don't really go together very well. You have to create a world and all its rules and somehow explain that to the audience. And in the same 45 minutes or whatever you've got, you have to tell a story. And doing those two things together is extremely hard. And I think in fantasy that's worse because there is more to explain about the world than there is in most murder stories, for example, or cop shows. We know that world, we recognize it. the fantasy world, we have to tell them Merlin has magic. This is what magic looks like. Actually, magic is banned. All these basic facts have to be got over in a dramatic way, but we still have to tell a story that's satisfying for that first episode. And that doesn't get any easier, to be honest.
Yeah,
really,
it was really difficult. It was really difficult to balance the story of the week with the introduction of the characters, and I think that was sort of the big creative debate that we had there. How could we sort of introduce all these characters, but the characters that were sort of, we had sort of reinvented the characters with these kind of, you know, with the names and the expectations, but it had recreated the characters in a very different way. And I think that was quite hard, sort of showing those to the, introducing those to the audience at the same time as trying to do a story of the week. And I think technically at that time it was really, you know, when we were doing, you know, a dragon and all of the ambition of it and the CGI of it was also really hard because, you know, it was 2008 and CGI on television wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. So I think there were kind of a lot of production challenges as well.
I mean, that kind of leads me on to my next question, which was, you know, is there anything in the episode that you think you'd do differently with hindsight?
Oh, definitely. But I think that, you know, I mean, Julian and I are terrible critics of our own work. So I think that we, you know, it was interesting watching it this evening because I was thinking, oh God, I'm going to really cringe at this. But actually what I really liked about it was that it did have a lot of charm. And I think I sort of forgotten how kind of charming it was. And the cast are very likable. And I was very pleased with all of that. But I think technically, you know, we've learned so much since we've made Merlin that if we were to go back, I think, yeah, technically we would do it very differently. Don't you think, Julian?
Yeah, listen, I think obviously the CGI is quite hard for us to watch given where we think we're now. But Johnny's right. The core of it, the characters and the cast, you wouldn't change, and those things matter more than CGI always. You know, I think the one thing that is absolutely true is we wouldn't recast it.
I mean, that kind of was what some of the people were talking in the questions about. But I was going to say, I mean, what do you think would have happened if you'd cast other people in the roles? I mean, you told me a couple of years ago that Matt Smith was in the line for Merlin. I mean, can you imagine a version of Merlin where that is Merlin?
It's now, no. But at the time, you know, this was a serious conversation we had. And I think probably the reason we went for Colin rather than Matt was very straightforward. Colin was younger. You know, he brought more innocence to it. And we felt that Merlin had to begin this series, at least, as almost as an innocent boy who was going on a journey to manhood. So it's incredibly hard to imagine what it would be like now. But a Merlin who was less innocent than Colin in that episode, less open and willing to, you know, show that vulnerability that he did, would have meant a different show. Absolutely.
Definitely. I'm now going to.
And it was a really hard show to cast. It was very hard to find the characters the actors that you thought had that likability and charm. And because funny enough, we had Karen Gillan was also on the shortlist to play Gwen. So there was quite, you know, looking back on the recalls now, there were a lot of really brilliant actors that we nearly kind of chose. But like Julian said, there wouldn't be anybody that we would, looking back, recast, because I think everybody, it's just one of those shows where all the cast just gelled beautifully. And, you know, not only did they do the parts brilliantly, but they were all a joy to work with. I mean, it was the 5 years of working with all of them was just such great fun. And, you know, and that seldom happens, that you have a group of people that get on so well and have such a fun under such kind of stressful, you know, situation of, you know, turning around 13 episodes every year for 5 years.
And across so many different sets as well, you know, some in France, you know, some in the UK, some in Wales.
Yeah, no, it was, we went to France a lot, you know, we forget that. We spent, I don't know, probably a third of each production year in France.
I think, sorry, Julian, Johnny.
No, I was just saying that, yeah, it was great fun going to Pierrefonds in France. I was, you know, each year I thought that my French would get better and it got worse and worse. And I always kind of look back on that period and just think, why didn't my French get any better? But it was such great fun in Pierrefonds. It was such an amazing location. and we sort of took over Pierrefonds every time we went there. And we used to just have such kind of fun in the village in the evenings, and it was a kind of and as the show became more popular, all the fans used to hang out in the village, and it was always just really good. I look back on it as just a really good fun time.
Well, here's an interesting thought experiment, because my first question from the fans, which we're going to move into now, is from an account called Merlin Feels. They asked, if you were filming The Dragon's Call in 2020, or maybe 2019, when filming was, actually a thing people could do, would you have made changes or done anything differently? In terms of not like, do you wish you'd done something differently, but if you were making the show today for the audience that there is now, Merlin hasn't existed before this point, would you do anything differently?
Would we do anything different? Sorry, you broke up.
Yeah, it's a different. That's an interesting question. I think in terms of how we wrote and conceived it, I don't know that we would. I think the core of it, the story of Arthur and Merlin and their relationship, and the wise servant and the king who doesn't realise who he really is, I'm not sure we would have changed. We might have in that first episode got a little bit further down the story than we did. We might have been wiser about that, but I don't think we'd have changed the heart of it. Obviously, the way we made it and thought of it and did the dragon, that would be wildly different now. We would have a confidence about what we could do with that creature that was miles beyond what we had then. Then we had no idea whether it was going to work at all, to be honest.
Yeah.
But now, you would think of that. So I suppose the climax of the episode, the whole, what happened in the banquet hall, we could do that, a lot better. Because technology has changed, and
I agree with Julian. I think that if we were to do it again, you would want the story of the week you would have wanted to have introduced the characters through the action of the story more, I think, of the week, and had a bigger story of the week. But I think that would be the main thing. And then obviously any technical things, there's quite a lot of technical things, like Julian said, that we could do better now.
Yeah.
I think we'd still have gone to Pierrefonds. Of all the castles we looked at, that would have still been the right choice.
Definitely. Yeah. It looks so perfect for the kind of world.
It really does, yeah.
I have a question now from Messalina, who's asking specifically about the Dragon's Call episode. She says, Morgana says, the more brutal you are, the more enemies you create. In a way, is that Morgana kind of foreseeing her own future as a villain?
We knew that Morgana would begin on the side of the angels and end up on the side of the devils. That we did know. So I think, yes, in her lines, there are, even from the very first episode, hints of where she's going to end up. And that was part of the fun of the series, because people who come to this story know it in some strange way. They know Merlin was a wizard who helped Arthur, and they know Morgana was, a witch of some sort who was potentially evil and wanted to see Arthur down. So you can play with that foresight, and I think we did. So yes, I think that line had that resonance.
And it was great fun doing those origin stories and subverting the expectation of the audience with that Guinevere is not the queen, the future queen, she's a servant, and playing around with all those expectations was always really good fun, and always good fun to write and storyline.
Another question I have from Tamara asks, how much research did you actually do about the Arthurian legend? Where did you pick information? And I guess what you've said there is you were, to an extent, trying to play off perceptions of it as much as follow it.
No, I don't think we ever set out to follow it, and it's impossible to follow. There are dozens of versions of it, and over hundreds of years. We were very aware of how these legendary characters were perceived now, and we did, as Johnny said, consciously play with that. And we did obviously read up about the legend, and we used all sorts of things, but I'm not sure you could say we researched it thoroughly. It was just things that resonated for us in terms of drama we used.
And we thought long and hard about the format to begin with, and the characters, and the beginning of the characters' stories. And we had, before the show was completely commissioned, we we spent a couple of days with Russell T Davies in Wales, and he was brilliant in helping us sort of imagine and work out the format of the show. And he helped us sort of think about, he always, you know, helped us think about it in a 5-year kind of cycle. And he was sort of very influential in the beginning in the way that we thought about it and the ambition that we had with the characters. Don't you think, Julian?
I think that's true. And I think probably it's true that as the series go on, by the time you get to series 4 and 5, the legend is a bigger part of it and we are more aware of it.
Yeah. Because it absolutely, that's very true, because it started off as sort of story of the week, but by the time we got to series 4 and 5, it was much more serialized, because it became really about Arthur fulfilling his destiny and Merlin as well. And so it became much more about those sort of the two characters and their relationships with, you know, Guinevere and Morgana. And so it was much more sort of serialized towards the end of it. And I think we became much more confident and ambitious in the stories that we were telling.
I've got a question here from Sherry about one character in particular. We've talked a bit there about how the series as a whole was conceived, but Sherry was asking, how did you conceive of Uther? Was he a villain, but sometimes sympathetic? Was he sometimes a morally ambiguous protagonist? And did you draw on any inspirations from real life historical figures or tyrants in shaping that character?
I don't think we ever thought of him as a villain. I think we thought of him as quite a troubled and damaged man who did villainous things because of the sort of the pressures he felt and his own demons. But we did want him to be also sympathetic, and we worked quite hard on that, because I think it was quite easy for him to become a pantomime villain, and I hope in the end he didn't. He was a bit more complicated than that. I'm not sure we had historical figures in our mind. I don't think so. I don't think we did, but Johnny might remember that we did.
No, I think that it was absolutely how you said, and I think that we wanted, you know, that he was a flawed man. He was a very hurt man because of the way his wife had died, and so his hatred of magic was born through an emotional for his grief of his wife who died. And so to us, he was sort of quite complicated and you know, sort of a grey kind of character, in that, you know, the more you learnt about him as the series progressed, the more you realised that actually he was quite a sort of lonely, isolated person. So yeah, the complexity of that we enjoyed exploring, and Anthony Head was kind of great as that in that role.
I mean, I think I've been rewatching a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer in lockdown to pass the time, and it is quite strange seeing, you know, in one series he's casting spells, and you know, and then the next series like all sorcery is outlawed, and there's something fun in, he's playing against the perception of him a little bit among fantasy fans in that.
Yeah, and obviously the Buffy sort of connection was in our heads, and it was nice for him to take on that sort of role. And I think fantasy shows you can do things like that. The baggage works for you, not against you.
I have a question here from Jessica. She says, firstly, the work that all the cast and crew put into creating the show was incredible. Has to be hands down one of my favorite shows ever. What was a highlight or fun moment of working on Merlin for you guys?
I think a highlight for me would have to be, because Julian and I and all of us, we used to do 13 episodes a year, so we were always chasing production, so we were always really, really busy. So we had kind of no idea of the effect of the show or how popular it was, because we were just stuck in this production cycle. And then once a year we'd go to Comic-Con in San Diego, and that was just this kind of strange moment where we were kind of, the first time we went, Julian and I and the cast went onto stage, and there were literally kind of hundreds and hundreds of people there, all kind of cheering and clapping. I remember kind of turning to Julian and just kind of going, oh my God, you know, this show really has got fans and people really do like watching it. And it was a real kind of moment where Julian and I could actually step out of, you know, the stress and worry about keeping the show running, and just for that moment enjoy the fact that, you know, it had sort of fans, and you know, and it's also rewarding that, you know, that people are enjoying what you're doing. I mean, that's kind of, it doesn't get better than that. So those experiences were all amazing, because it just felt extraordinary that we had, you know, a fan base for the show.
And we used to get towards the end at PFL, lots of fans would turn up, and we'd turn around in filming, and there'd be 100 people watching us. We had to get really careful about what we said and what we shouted, because we'd give the story away. But in the end, it was wonderful that people wanted to come to that and see that place and join in that process.
And I think also the actors that we were able to get as well as guest parts. I remember, arriving on a Monday morning when we were starting filming, and I said, "Oh, who's in today?" And they were like, "Oh, Charles Dance is in." I was like, "Oh yeah, Charles Dance is in this week, brilliant." And it was just, that kind of fun of that sort of, in Wales, just outside of Cardiff, in our studio base, and there's Charles Dance rocking up in his car, and being the Witchfinder General. And I think there's those sort of surreal moments which were really good fun.
John actually asked a little bit about that, the popularity that you're talking about there with the Comic-Con experience and having fans come to set. I mean, he asked, did you feel more pressure writing episodes after it became popular, or was it similar to before?
I think that Julian and I made a conscious decision actually when the show, because Facebook and Twitter were very big, or becoming very big whilst when the show was becoming popular, that we took a decision to kind of come off all of those social media things. So we didn't sort of pay any attention to what people were saying, and so that kind of took away the sort of the pressure, and so we just focused on following our instincts of what we wanted to do with the show. And felt that was the best way of dealing with it, rather than kind of worrying about what people were thinking. So that was sort of our way of dealing with it in a way.
Silver asks, were there any ideas for episodes you had which never became actual episodes, and why did you decide not to use them?
There were hundreds of ideas for episodes. I would say we made 13 episodes a year, and we probably looked at 30 stories before we picked, before we settled on 13. And sometimes we'd write out detailed treatments and storylines and then throw the story away. God, I'm trying to think if I can remember any, because I think you tend to banish those from your mind. But there were plenty of times we went down blind alleys and stories that just didn't work.
There was one episode that was going to be our first episode, and I can't remember whether it was the beginning of series 1 or series 2. And we got the script and we were really happy with it. And then when it was delivered, Julian and we just sat down and went, this isn't a first episode, this is a final episode. And so suddenly we were in this situation where we'd started the series and we had our final episode, but we didn't have our first episode. So I remember that being quite a stressful point of going, blimey, what are we going to do for episode 1?
One of the hardest ones to get, because we knew we had to do it and we just didn't know how to do it in our way, were the 2 Sword in the Stone episodes that I think are the end of series 4, where Arthur draws the sword out of the stone. And we really struggled to find a way of doing that was true to our Arthur and Merlin. And I think there were probably 5 or 6 versions of that story before we went for one.
Yeah, that's right. I remember, because it was very difficult, because there were versions of it I remember that were really glib, and we kept going, no, we can't be that glib with it. We have to serve that mythology with respect, but at the same time try and undercut it in a kind of Merlin, Arthur, Jeeves and Worcester way. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of an interesting point, because one of the questions I have here from a person called Aegis is, while writing the series, were there things that took you ages to agree upon because of different opinions? And, if yes, can you give any examples? Were there any differences of opinion about how best to sort of tell stories?
Yeah, there was a massive worry. I think from the BBC mostly about that Sword in the Stone episode, because we were almost saying that Merlin turned it into a trick. It was a trick to make Arthur see his true value again. And we said, yeah, of course it's a trick. But the point is that the psychological story of Merlin, Arthur's friend, helping him to realize what he really is and what value he really has, is an honest and true emotional story. But there was a real issue with that one, because people felt we were taking an incredibly sacred thing of the man who draws the sword out the stone and playing with it and doing something we shouldn't have done. But actually, emotionally, the story really worked, because it was about two friends who have this relationship, and the fact that Merlin could help Arthur see his true value again. So it's a good example of that, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There were lots of disagreements. I mean, when we were going to kill Uther was a source of immense debate, because we knew we were going to do it, but when we were going to do it, we talked about forever.
Yeah.
And I guess, you know, Uther's kind of a controversial figure, I know, among fans, because, you know, he has this, you know, lighter side, this sort of forgiving side, but he does such dark things, particularly to, you know, Arthur and Morgana. Do you think that that was the most challenging part about telling that character?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, one of the episodes people remember the most is the troll one, where
Yeah.
Marsh turns into a troll. And, you know, and Tony was brilliant at that, because he's brilliant at that sort of light comedy. And he can be very beguiling. He's a very charming guy, and he can play Uther in a very charming way. And I think if we hadn't had him, the game we played with Uther, where he was sometimes this sort of relaxed, charming guy, but was actually doing horribly ruthless things, wouldn't have worked. I think part of that, you know, part of the credit for that has to go to Tony Head, because he's very good at that. And he was brilliant in that troll episode, at just playing this sort of almost a buffoon, but he was still Uther. He was still dangerous.
And I think that was the reasons why we picked him, was that, like Julian said, he's very, as an actor, he has that lightness of touch, and because of his experience in doing these high concept shows as an actor, he's very adept at changing his tone and still keeping a kind of likability. So he can go from being ruthless to being, you know, to having fun, and there's always a sort of twinkle in his eye in his performance, which was perfect for the show, because you couldn't help but like him.
And obviously, I'm sure that, like, every cast member in the show brought their own kind of unique sensibility to their characters, and in, you know, in a lot of ways, they've all gone off to do such great things that, you know, you can see the origins in Merlin. But I have a question here from Rockin, who's sort of saying, wondering whether there were any examples of times cast members went off script or ad-libbed, and those scenes made it on screen, or points where they might have said, "Oh, maybe we should try this," and that actually made it in.
I think we were pretty strict on the scripts, Julian and I. We kind of, you know, any kind of sort of paraphrasing or things was sort of slapped down quite quickly. But I think that, you know, what the actors did bring, and, you know, there was a fantastic chemistry between Bradley and Colin, which, you know, we always hoped for, but they worked together so brilliantly. And so, you know, it then made it very easy to write for them. And so the writers just enjoyed that kind of playfulness that those two actors had. And it was always great to sort of, you know, you could storyline more or less anything, and you knew it would work, and they would make it jump off the page. So I think it was more that the on-screen chemistry that they all brought, which was great.
Julian, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think we were we stuck to the script quite strictly in that show. I'm not saying there aren't great one-liners that Colin and Bradley came up with at certain moments. I'm sure there are, but it wasn't often.
Yeah. On a similar note, I've got a question from someone called archaeologist_D, who asked, for each of the series, did you sit down and map out each person's story arc? Did you sort of argue about it? Was it one voice that told the writers what that should be? And did the actors have any influence in their characters' development?
These things are always complicated. Yes, we did sit down and try and arc the series each year. We sat down for a couple of days with all the writers, or most of them, usually all of them. And we would come out with a document that gave us a plan. And I would say it lasted all of 3 weeks, because the process just doesn't work like that. As you then start to work on that arc you think works, it takes you in a slightly different direction, and a character goes in a different direction, and you go, oh, but that's brilliant, that takes you here, and suddenly that changes. That sounds chaotic, but actually that's just a normal process. And the writers
we did have
as well, you know.
we did have a few kind of roadmap moments that we knew that we were aiming for sort of mid-season or at the end of a series.
Yeah.
So we sort of had those things, but like Julian said, we would spend a lot of time kind of talking about the series. I remember eating a lot of chocolate muffins as well, seemed to be the kind of part of the inspiration. But yeah, like Julian said, that as the script started, as you started writing the scripts and you started discovering the stories, all of those kind of arcs changed just because the scripts and the ideas changed.
I think actor-wise, there were constant conversations with the cast about how to play things, about where their character was, and sometimes that got quite complicated. But they were never really involved in the storylining process. You can't easily do that, and they were also a young cast predominantly, so that tends to limit that. But we did map it and we did change it a lot. I think that happens on most shows one way or another.
Yeah, it's just the natural process, I suppose.
Yeah.
We got quite a few technical questions in about specifics of the show, which I'm not going to go into too much about the geography and stuff of Merlin, but I did quite like this question from Sim, which asked, how old are all of the characters exactly? Is Leon the oldest knight? Is Morgana younger or older than Arthur? How much is Merlin younger than Arthur?
God, I'm not even sure I can remember exactly. It's quite
well the characters or the actors.
Characters, I think.
The character. Merlin is slightly younger than Arthur. Morgana is technically younger than Arthur. Is Leon?
Gaius is older than Merlin.
Gaius is older than Merlin. No, is Leon the oldest knight? Probably. Although I'm not sure we ever thought of it like that.
Yeah.
I think we just all thought of them as contemporaries, really. The younger cast, they were all basically going through the same things, the same things in their lives, same emotional journeys.
Yeah.
On a similar note, Hannah asks, is it correct that the show would have roughly spanned across 10 years if you include all the time jumps?
We thought it was about 8, but 10 is a crazy suggestion.
Makes sense.
In our head, it was around about 8.
Yeah. One of the things we got the most questions about was about figurative, and sorry, just going to plug my computer in, both a figurative or an actual season 6, by which I mean quite a few people asked, did you ever discuss a season 6 and what would it have looked like? Would it have been similar to 5 but just spread out over 2 series, or would it have been very different?
We didn't ever discuss the season 6.
That's an easy answer.
I mean, we always saw it as 5 years, and we wouldn't have been able to contract the actors for any more than that. And so it was always to us 5 years, and 5 years, 13 episodes. It was a labor of love, but after 5 years, 13 episodes each year, by the end we were pretty burnt out, the actors and everybody, and we wanted to leave the series on a high and not sort of be one of those series that just goes on and on and on and gradually just loses its audience. And so we all felt it was right to end at that point. So like Julian said, there was no kind of thought of series 6.
I do have a question from Amy who asks, did you ever think about what happened after the finale? What happened to Gaius and Gwen and the rest of Camelot, and what's Merlin doing now while he's waiting for Arthur to rise again?
Yeah, of course you think about it, and of course you could spin off other series. I mean, but I think that series' moment has gone, and I think the best way to think of that is someone else will come along and take that extraordinary, wonderful material of that legend and build something new, just as writers have been doing for 1,200 years probably, or maybe 1,100 years, a long time. So I think we do. Of course we do. We imagine what Camelot is like under Gwen's rule, and it would possibly be a good TV series. But I think you have to let these things go. That series was at that moment in time, and the way to think of it is look at that legend, look how rich it is, and find the next version of it.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But what is Merlin doing now? That's the real question.
Oh, well, Merlin's still out there, but he's, I hope he's not sleeping as rough as he was.
Yeah, he looked a bit scruffy in the
He's found a small cottage somewhere in the West Country.
to self-isolate. I have a question here from MK, which is something I was actually going to ask you guys at the top, but I saved it for this. How close did you guys come to making a movie? Because you mentioned this at San Diego Comic-Con one year, and this commenter said he'd heard 2 movies were a possibility.
That there was talk, and I don't think we got that close, but there was an appetite to do it. The trouble with the movie always was the fear that if you do it while the TV series is on, does it damage the series? Which by then was, all over the world and an important show. And I think our feeling was, if you were to do a movie, you had to wait till the TV series had run its course. And there just wasn't, to make a big British fantasy action film is hard at the best of times. There just wasn't the momentum to do it, but there were conversations on several occasions.
Yeah, we did. We talked a lot about when we would do it, how we would do it, what the story would be, what the arc would be, and there were lots, like Julian said, there were lots of conversations. But at the point where we could have done it, Guy Ritchie had just started developing his Arthurian movie, and so there was a worry that which movie company would you take it to, and all of those things. And by that point, sometimes movies take so long that it was we'd finished, and everybody else was doing, all the other actors were doing other things, and so it sort of became impossible.
Would it have been reuniting the TV cast though? Would that have been the idea if that was a Merlin movie?
Yeah, I think the cast were one of the great strong points of the show, and I think you had to, it was a different take. It was a Merlin and Arthur who were contemporaries, and that was different, and who had a fascinating, funny, complicated relationship, and that would have to have been the heart of the movie.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I will just have a couple more questions. One question here from Marika is quite a good one. She's saying, personally, what were your favourite episodes or your most emotional episodes?
I think my favourite episodes must have been the last series with when we kind of the Lady in the Lake episodes, and the kind of I think the final episode. I found the final series very moving, all of it, just because the friendship between the two characters was so deep at that point that it was the episodes felt they had more emotional depth because of where the characters were in their arc. So I think the last series, those episodes are my favourite.
Julian?
I love the episode with John Lynch when he plays Merlin's father in the Dragon Lord ep is a great ep.
Yeah, right.
I think most of the Lancelot episodes are favourites of mine. I think there's something brilliant about that. And there's an episode in the last series, the Drawing of the Dark. I think it's episode 11, which I think is pretty great. It's where Morgana discovers Merlin is the key.
A pivotal moment in the series.
Yeah.
Well, listen, guys, thank you so much for taking time to chat to me. I have one final question, which was asked by a few people. It's possibly the most important question of the night. They've asked, Merlin only wears one outfit for most of the series. Does he have 5 each of the same garment, or does he have an outfit he wears when it's in the wash, but it's so rarely worn we don't see it?
He had about...
Is that...
Sorry, Johnny?
Well, I was just saying, is that the character or the practicality of filming it?
I guess you could answer both.
We consciously decided to... I guess it's like making Superman, to keep Merlin in one outfit for kind of those reasons. He must have had dozens of it by the end. I said more than 20 versions of it. There were doubles for stunts, for all sorts of things.
We did once, though, give him a quilted waistcoat that he wore for when Arthur was crowned king. That I remember Colin being really pleased that we'd put him in one different costume at last. But yeah, I think, and definitely Merlin, the character, obviously had seven jackets, 7 shirts, and 7 pairs of trousers that he wore each day and then washed them. He was very, very, very clean character.
Assiduous. Didn't he have one that was a reverse, like a red top and a blue?
He did have variations. But not in the first series, but I think eventually he did have variations. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, guys, thank you so much for joining me, and sorry about the technical difficulties earlier. But yeah, thanks for joining us for this Q&A after our watch along of The Dragon's Call. And yeah, thank you for still chatting about Merlin and engaging with the fans all this time after it's been on TV. It's been what, 8 years? 8 years since it was on?
Yeah. Long time now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, long time. Well, thank you all for tuning in and watching.
I'm glad you enjoy it.
Cheers. Okay, guys, thank you so much. And to all the fans watching, thanks for joining in, and we'll see you at the next watch along.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks you.
Definitely.